بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. باب كتابة العلم. This chapter is about writing knowledge. وعنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إن الله حبس عن مكة الفيل أو القتل وسلط عليهم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والمؤمنون ألا فإنها لا تحل لأحد قبلي ولا تحل لأحد بعدي ألا وإنها حلت لي ساعة من نهار ألا وإنها ساعتي هذه حرام. So we went over this last time, at least some of it, and that is the sacredness of Mecca and the impermissibility of physical combat to occur in that sanctuary. So I'm not going to go into that again, but here we get a little bit more detail, and that is لا يختلى شوكها ولا يعضد شجرها ولا تلتقط ساقطتها إلا لمنشد. So here the Prophet ﷺ says that there are very specific rulings regarding being inside the Haram area. So I'm guessing we've all been there, and maybe you've done multiple umrahs. If you've done multiple umrahs while there, you'll remember this. And that is when you want to do a second umrah, what do you have to do? You have to take a car out to Masjid Aisha, right? Why? Well, if you notice, when you get to Masjid Aisha, you'll see this sign that says you're exiting the Haram area, right? And then when you're coming back, it says you're entering the Haram area. So the sanctuary that we're talking about that has these specific rulings is within those borders. It's not all of what's today Mecca. Mecca is larger than what it was back in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, as is Medina today. So we're talking about that specific area. If you are within it, there are specific rulings, including things that are halal normally, but there it's haram. And the Prophet ﷺ mentions three. لا يختلى شوكها. The shawk is like the thorns, the plant life. You're not allowed to pull plants. ولا يعضد شجرها. You're not allowed to break trees. Right? And here specifically it's referring to that which is natural. That which nature, of course through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made through nature. But that which has been engineered by humans, right? Let's say there's the Department of Agriculture in Mecca, and they made the landscaping in Mecca. That human-made landscaping does not apply here. You're allowed to pull it, and you don't have to. It's not considered haram, but that which is natural is considered haram. And number three, ولا تلتقط ساقطتها إلا لمنشد. ساقطة means that which somebody loses, something, a possession that they lose. Let's say you have a little bit of money, a wallet, let's say, and it drops. You forget your purse in the Haram, in Mecca area. You're not allowed, nobody's allowed to take it. So if you're walking by and you see a purse, you see a wallet, you're not allowed to take it. Even though we mentioned in the previous hadith that if you're walking here, on the sidewalk and you see some money, you're allowed to take it. And if it's of low value, it's yours. If it's of higher value, you have to go through a process, right? In Mecca, whether it's small, large, you're not even allowed to pick it up. Right? Leave it there. Except if the owner says, can you hand it to me? Or if the owner is saying, does anyone see a purse? Anyone see a purse that's next to you? You pick it up and you give it to that person. Or what you can add to that is you take it to the lost and found. In the Haram, there is a lost and found. You take it, you say, I found this. You give it to the lost and found area. Make it easier for people to recollect their belongings. فمن قتل فهو بخير النظرين إما أن يعقل وإما أن يقاد أهل القتيل. So if somebody is killed in this area, right, you're not allowed to execute that person yourself. There's a legal process that needs to be enacted, and the Prophet says, alayhi salatu wasalam, you have two choices. Yu'qal, meaning you imprison them. Aqil is from tying, right? You imprison them, or أن يقاد أهل القتيل, or you take the blood money from the family of the perpetrator. Right? فجاء رجل من أهل اليمن فقال اكتب لي يا رسول الله فقال اكتبوا لأبي فلان فقال رجل من قريش إلا الإذخر يا رسول الله فإنا نجعله في بيوتنا وقبورنا فقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إلا الإذخر. So somebody from Yemen was there listening to the Prophet ﷺ as he's explaining this, and he said, Ya Rasulullah, can somebody write this down for us? Right? So the Prophet told somebody to write it down. That's the point of this chapter, that part of knowledge is writing it down. And okay, well, that's kind of obvious. What are we gaining from it here? Maybe we're not gaining anything revolutionary, but it is just further information that part of Islam and part of knowledge and disseminating knowledge is being adamant about the preservation of knowledge. Knowledge is preserved through writing. That's how it reaches generation to generation. We have books that were written over 1,200 years ago and still studied today. Right? Why? Because it was written. Sometimes it was written by the individual, the author himself, or sometimes it was brought into a book through one of their students. Right? But the idea is Muslims should be aware that we must preserve knowledge as part of our responsibility. Like if it's our responsibility at the individual level and the communal level to pursue knowledge, then it's also our responsibility to preserve knowledge as well. Right? So we need to have our publishing organizations. We need to have publishers. We need to have people whose expertise is to preserve this knowledge. Alhamdulillah, we do. So when I was studying in Jordan, those who did their PhD, they had two options in terms of graduation. They can write a dissertation, right? Write about a topic and defend it, or they can do what's called tahqiq of a manuscript. They can take a manuscript, meaning this is an original writing by an individual of the past that has yet to be converted into print. Right? So you can imagine a scholar back in the day, they wrote a book, they wrote it on whatever paper they had back then, and they would put it in a library. Nowadays, they're in museums, right? And one option in terms of getting your PhD over there is to find one of these manuscripts that has yet to be printed, and then to do tahqiq, to go through it, verify it. Sometimes you have a word that's smeared, sometimes a word is missing, sometimes not legible. So their work is to try and make sense of all of this and put it into print form. Right? This what we have with Bukhari. Bukhari didn't write it like this. He wrote it on paper, or his students did, and then more recently you have people go find it and then put it into what's now modern print. All right? And subhanAllah, when was France or Britain, whichever one, entered Egypt. Egypt had one of the biggest libraries in Alexandria. It had the second biggest library in the world, I think. And in it were nearly 500 manuscripts. These are 500 books written by Muslims sometime in Islamic history. By the time the British left, there were only 50 remaining. They took 450, right? Meaning, there could be works by Bukhari, there could be books by Ghazali, by Ibn Taymiyyah, by Imam Ahmad, by Abu Hanifa that exist, but we don't know about because they've been taken. Right? So, we need to make sure that this process of finding these books and claiming our Islamic history and our Islamic knowledge, make sure that we claim this, right? And it's a skill, right? It's a job, it's a profession, it's a career. So here you have this going on. Somebody from Yemen asked the Prophet ﷺ to write it down. The Prophet ﷺ had someone write it down. And then somebody from Quraysh said, Ya Rasulullah, make an exception. Remember the rulings that we just said? You can't pull any plants. One individual from Quraysh, and in another hadith it's Al-Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, said, Ya Rasulullah, make an exception for idkhir. What is idkhir? Idkhir is a plant that has a very nice smell. Has a very nice scent. And they would use it back in the day to make a little bit of fragrance in their homes and other places, and by the graves, right? So he said, Ya Rasulullah, make this an exception. The Prophet said, okay, it's an exception. You can go ahead and pull it out. Now, very interesting. We can't make exceptions to rulings in our times. It's not like somebody here can say, oh, Shaykh, make an exception for this. It's done, right? The Prophet ﷺ did it. But why did he allow it? Perhaps when you look at other parts of the Sharia, you find that the Sharia is very conscious of beauty. So the Prophet ﷺ said, you are prohibited from killing 4 types of animals. The bee, the ant, the hoopoe, the hudhud, and the surad. The surad is a small bird that chirps. Those chirping birds that people put in their homes?
Sparrow?
Not a sparrow, a chirping bird. The small birds that chirp, they have a nice chirp.
Finches.
No, not a parakeet. A parakeet is not a hummingbird.
Finches.
The birds that people put in their homes that chirp, and they have a really nice chirp, right? Nobody does this anymore? Anyway, a surad is a small bird that has a very nice chirp. You know how when you're in the park, you hear a bird chirping? That's a surad, right there. So the Prophet ﷺ prohibits us from killing these 4, except for for a certain reason. Some people come and ask, Shaykh, there's ants infesting our home, but the Prophet said don't kill them. You could get rid of them, right? No problem there. But if you're walking around and you see a bee, you see an ant, try avoid killing it. Right? Why? Why these 4 things? Well, bees do what?
Honey.
They make honey, which, right? Honey has a beautiful taste. It's a sweet taste. It adds sweetness to your life, right? And it's healthy. And on top of that, they pollinate flowers. I've read that we're always finding new types of flowers. Why? Because of cross-pollination from the bees. So bees beautify the earth, subhanAllah. And even the way they work together, people study just the habits of bees. Very organized. Look at the honeycomb. How geometrically speaking, it's perfect engineering. So there's beauty to it. Ants, although if you really zoom in on an ant, it's very ugly. But the way ants work together, the teamwork, right? Plus, the ant in the Quran, the moment of the ant with Sulaiman alayhi salam, the ant did what? It warned the other ants. So subhanAllah, if you see an ant in a dream, it refers to a da'i. Somebody who calls to Islam.
Wow.
Yeah. Or somebody who's trying to bring good to their community or their people by warning them. Because that's what the ant did. So you see the characteristic of an ant. And apparently, if one ant is injured, other ants will come and save it. Right? And if there's a large piece of food that one ant can't carry, it'll go call the other ants, it'll come together. Right? So there's a type of beauty there. And then the hoopoe, or the hudhud, have you ever seen one in real life? There are some things that look pretty, they look beautiful, and there are some things that its beauty it captures you. Like you are just drawn to it. That's a hudhud. I've seen the hudhud once in real life. And you might find other birds that are equally beautiful, equally colorful, but there's something about this bird, it just captures you, subhanAllah. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful. So that beauty. And of course, the story of the hudhud in the Quran with Sulaiman alayhi salam, also somebody who called, right? And when you think of the task that Sulaiman gave to the hudhud, go from Jerusalem to Yemen. Do you know how long of a distance that is? That's like from Los Angeles to New York. And it's even more difficult because you're passing through very difficult desert. And so the hudhud is very small. It's not the fastest bird, but Sulaiman knew it was for the job. Go to this area and check it out. How was it able to do it? Well, apparently, I mean, don't quote me, but fact check me, but apparently the hudhud has the ability to detect water underground. It has the ability to detect water underground. So even if it's in the desert, it could find areas where there's water hidden.
Isn't it mentioned in the Quran? You know, Saba,
وَجِئْتُكَ بِنَبَإٍ جِئْتُكَ بِخَبَإٍ.
He's the one who finds out that that's the water.
Either way, anyway. So there's a beauty to it. And the surah, the bird, it beautifies, just where you are. You see these small birds flying around. I mean, imagine next time you're at a park, when you go to Irvine Regional Park, imagine there are no birds, there are no animals around. Right? It's just empty. It really takes away from the experience. There's not too many birds to where it's annoying, but there's enough where there's a little bit of movement, commotion, interaction, and you hear the sounds that they make. It just beautifies it. So, looking at this, the idkhir, it gives a sense of beauty, a good scent. And never underestimate this. When you go to hotels, there's always a distinct smell. When you go to high-end shops, like if you go to South Coast Plaza, I've never entered, there's no point, but if you enter one of these shops, they have a distinct smell. It's part of the experience. And now that smell always reminds you of something. There is a smell that comes here in the spring. It's like a tangerine smell. I don't know what it is. You could smell it here, right? Right? Whenever I smell that, you know what I remember? I remember Legoland. Because that smell is everywhere in Legoland. Right? So the scent plays a very important role. Now when you think of Mecca and Medina, there is a distinct scent. They put it in the carpets that you pray on. It's all over. It's in the air. Like as soon as you enter Mecca or Medina, you smell it. That enhances the experience, right? So the Islam, the Sharia wants to beautify our lives, not so that we become attached to the world, but it does so much for the mindset, for the mind. It makes you more optimistic, more energetic, more positive. So here, Al-Abbas took a moment, an opportunity to make sure that they can benefit from this, because maybe this plant is specific to Mecca. It's not in Medina. So when they go to Mecca, they want to take it with them to Medina. So maybe that was really going on. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. عن ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنهما قال لما اشتد بالنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وجعه قال ائتوني بكتاب أكتب لكم كتابا لا تضلوا بعده فقال عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه إن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم غلبه الوجع وعندنا كتاب الله تعالى حسبنا فاختلفوا وكثر اللغط فقال قوموا عني ولا ينبغي عندي التنازع. Here Ibn Abbas رضي الله تعالى عنه says that when the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام was nearing his death, right, his pain became very, very powerful, or very much. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Bring me paper so that something can be written, so that I can write something for you that you won't be misguided afterwards." So Umar radiallahu ta'ala an says, the Prophet ﷺ is not thinking straight. You know how when you're in incredible pain, people are getting closer to death, they start hallucinating, they start seeing things. So Umar thought, radiallahu ta'ala, this is what's happening. So Umar said, don't bring any paper. The Prophet ﷺ isn't thinking straight, and we have the Book of Allah. It's enough for us. What else is he going to write? What is Umar thinking? The Prophet ﷺ said, when I write this, you won't be misguided, right? And Umar is thinking, well, that's the Quran. The Quran protects us from misguidance, and the Prophet ﷺ has said in other occasions that if you hold on to the Book of Allah, you won't be misguided afterwards. You'll be fine. So, what is there to add? The Quran is enough for us. But others said, no, the Prophet ﷺ told us to do something, we're going to do it, and then they argued with each other, and the argument, it got loud. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, leave me, go away from here. and it is not appropriate for you all, for anyone to differ or to argue in front of me. So it wasn't written. Now, what did the Prophet ﷺ want to write? The scholars, they theory craft here. There's no way of knowing for sure. We don't know. Maybe it's a dua. It could be a dua. It could be a name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if we knew it, that we wouldn't be misguided. Right? So who knows? But some scholars said that the Prophet ﷺ was going to write who will be the Khalifa after him. Some scholars said that. Now, of course, they're theory crafting. Because if you look right after, they almost differed over this. This was the first thing that they were going to differ over. In fact, this is the first thing that caused problems within the ummah in the time of Ali, radiallahu ta'ala an, right? So, it's not that the Prophet ﷺ was saying you won't be misguided overall after this, but rather you won't go astray, you won't find problems regarding this particular issue. Right? Maybe that's it, maybe it's not. Right? Wallahu ta'ala alam. But the point here in relation to the chapter is that the Prophet ﷺ wanted to write something down. And again, this ties into what I mentioned last time, but I reiterate. Those who who say that hadith wasn't written until 100 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, that's an incorrect statement. It's false. Hadith was being written during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And it was being written and transmitted during the life of the Prophet and the companions. How do we know this? Well, the Prophet ﷺ prohibited the companions from writing the statements of the Prophet ﷺ initially. And then a hadith comes where the Prophet ﷺ says, بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً. Teach people what I say, even if it's one verse. This is, although including the Quran, it is more so talking about hadith. Why did the Prophet ﷺ initially prohibit the companions from writing down his statements? So it doesn't get mixed up with the Quran. You know, the Gospels, there's Mark and Luke and Matthew and whatever. What are they? What are those? These are essentially commentaries from these individuals about Isa alayhi salam. So let's just say that these four individuals were actually alive during the time of Isa alayhi salam, which is questionable, which some Christians even say that's not true, right? But let's just say that they were alive during the time of Isa and they were there with him 24/7. Essentially what they are giving are their own accounts of what Isa alayhi salam did, right? And so the whole question of the Bible or the New Testament is very strange, to the extent that even some scholars of Islam ask the question, is the Injil that Allah is talking about this? Because it doesn't seem to be. I don't know, this isn't my field, I haven't researched here, right? But what seems to happen over time in Christianity is that commentaries from people made its way into the Injil. And what we have now is bits and pieces of the Injil that has been mixed with commentaries of scholars, or what we would call mufassirin, so to speak, right? So to avoid this from happening with the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ initially told the companions, do not write down what I am saying. Therefore, anything written of religious content in Medina was known to be Quran, because that was the only thing that they were allowed to write. Right? But later on, when the Prophet felt comfortable with the companions and that they got the situation, they understand the sensitivity here, the Prophet then said, بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً. Right? Go ahead and start to transmit my hadith, including writing it down. And Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala an says that I am the most knowledgeable of hadith, meaning I know the most hadith from the Prophet, and there's only one person who knows more than me, and that is Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As. Why? he said, Abu Hurairah says, because he would write hadith and I didn't know how to write. So you have this going on, right? Okay. Next chapter, Babul Ilmi wal Idati bil Layl. A chapter about knowledge and learning at night. عن أم سلمة رضي الله تعالى عنها قالت استيقظ النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ذات ليلة فقال سبحان الله ماذا أنزل الليلة من الفتن وماذا فتح من الخزائن أيقظوا صواحب الحجر فرب كاسية في الدنيا عارية في الآخرة. Here the Prophet ﷺ's wife Salama said that one night the Prophet woke up and said, Subhanallah, what has come down from tribulations, fitan, and what has been opened from the treasures of the earth. So the Prophet ﷺ would be shown things that would happen, right? And I mean, we can be a little bit imaginative here in terms of kind of why the Prophet ﷺ would be shown these things, and specifically what he means by it came down tonight. So it's not that these things that he saw or was informed about happened there and then on that night, but they were going to happen sooner or later. He could have been shown something that we are experiencing now from the fitan, but he saw it then. So maybe what it means that unzil al-layla min al-fitan, tonight it came down, why we're in our current situation is something that requires you to go back 300 years to understand, right? When you look at your generation, and even more so your parents' generation, and even more so their parents' generation, what was Islam to these generations? What was it? My great aunt, who I used to visit often, before she passed away, would tell me stories of when she was a young girl and her mother would take her to a tree where they would worship in Palestine. In Palestine. And I told her, I felt like I needed to tell her, that's shirk, that's wrong. She said, no, everyone was doing it. They didn't even know. They didn't know. Islam was so distant to their mind, they were so uninformed about it. Like we look like the average Muslim today seems like a scholar in comparison to what they knew.
So you're not allowed to pray under the tree?
She didn't pray salah under a tree. They worshipped the tree.
Oh, they worship.
And they would do oaths and slaughter by the tree. Shirk stuff. Right? You ask the question, what happened? How did something so basic about Islam that all Muslims today understand? You know what? Christians and Jews who live in the Muslim world know this about Islam. How do they not know? Well, you go back a little bit further. And what you find in the last 100, 200 years of the Ottoman Empire, Islam was nothing more than a name. A name. Just, we're Muslims. That's it. There was no interest in Islam. People weren't interested about Islam. People didn't go and study Islam. It was a career if you did. Like it's just like being a professor at a school. No different than being a professor of psychology or being a professor of anthropology or being a professor of paleontology. You're a professor of Islam. That's it. I mean, it had no meaning. People weren't interested about pursuing Islam and growing Islam and doing projects for Islam. It was nothing more than a name. And how that happened is because the Ottoman Empire stopped putting resources or really limited the resources that they put in the Islamic studies. Earlier in the Ottoman Empire, a judge would always be a professor of Islam. They would do the same, do it both. Right? Why? Well, because knowledge was important and the role of the judge was understood to be more than just somebody who says, this is the ruling here, this is the ruling there. They saw themselves as leaders of society. right? And Islam is more than simply being behind a table and giving judgments, right? But the second reason, the pay of a professor was quite good. So you had the salary of a judge or the salary of a professor. Oh, you're doing really well. But then the Ottoman Empire significantly reduced the amount of money professors got, significantly. So that profession stagnated. You know how now the problem of school teachers? Yeah. There's a huge void, a huge demand for school teachers. Why? Because the pay is so low. Yeah. It's not even worth it, right? And look at the problems that could cause over time. Well, you have a model. So perhaps when the Prophet ﷺ says, Unzila layla, the fitan came down tonight, the seeds that will eventually lead to those things happen then, right? Even if you look at how the Muslim world went from being a superpower, as one of my professors of history said, if a Martian from Mars, an alien from Mars, came to the Earth in the 16th century, meaning the 1500s, they would look at the Earth and say, yep, everybody's going to be Muslim. From how powerful the Ottoman Empire was. Nothing could move in the seas except by the permission of the Ottomans. Nothing. Right? Look at it today. Completely changed. When did that start? In 1492. When Europe was still in the Dark Ages. The seed for what is now the situation started in 1492. Why? Because in 1492, that's when Christopher Columbus came this way. And at the same time, that is the year when the Ottoman Empire banned the printing press. It's not no writing. The ability to disseminate knowledge became ineffective, or there was a more effective means of disseminating knowledge, cost less, that the Ottomans said no. If you go on Amazon or a bookstore and you look at the price of books, how much is a book? 15, 20, $25. If you want to be a scholar, if you want to really learn, how much money do you need a year for books? A lot. If you're a student, that's when people really take knowledge in. You can't afford it. You can't afford it. And when the economy is not doing well, the first thing you're going to give up is what? Books. Right? So if books aren't affordable, knowledge is going to stagnate and going to fall back. And so your constant need of developing ways of printing, of sharing knowledge that is costless. And you look at the early Islamic history, when the Muslims entered into Persia and these areas, they captured 2 soldiers from China. Right? They found 2 soldiers from China, or 3. Back then, China had the best methods of creating paper. So what did the Muslims do? They said, look, each one of you teach 10 people how to make paper, we'll let you go. They said, okay. And so Muslims learned paper. And from there, what happened? Knowledge spread. But when they banned the printing press, knowledge started to recede, to go back. You think it's so insignificant. You think Sultan Sulaiman, right, one of the greatest political leaders in all of human history, ever thought that that's what's going to happen when he said no printing press? Or whoever the Sultan, it wasn't Sultan Sulaiman, it was on two before him, Bayezid or whoever it was. Do you think in his mind he thought that it would have such major ramifications? No, absolutely not. So unzila layla min al-fitan. So fitan will come down, the seeds of it, what will eventually lead to these problems. But what's very interesting here, I think even more interesting, is that the Prophet then says, وَمَاذَا فُتِحَ مِنَ الْخَزَائِنِ, and what treasures have been opened. And what you will find is that whenever there's a fitna, there are treasures elsewhere. The history shows this. Now, when people think of the Dark Ages of Europe, I mean, it's called the Dark Ages for a reason. It was dark. It is far worse than what Muslims are experiencing today, right? But did you know? So when we think the Dark Ages of Europe, we think all of Europe. No, it was Western Europe. When you get east into what's now Slovakia and Yugoslavia and Greece, that was the Byzantine Empire, and they were very wealthy. They used to trade with the Ottomans. Right? They were doing very well. And the Muslims are doing well where? Damascus, Egypt, Iraq, we're doing very well. And the Gulf area was very poor. Up until a few decades ago, Somalia used to send their zakah to Saudi Arabia. Somalia used to send their zakah to Saudi Arabia. Egypt used to sponsor the cloth of the Kaaba. Oh, how times have changed, right? And so while the fitan spread in what was the flourishing part of the Muslim world, the wealth simply left that area and went somewhere else. Today, the wealthy part of the Muslim world is where? The Gulf. Not just the Gulf. You also have the Malaysia is doing very well. Singapore is doing very well. Turkey is all over the place, but there's an amount of, they're powerful in terms of global politics and whatnot. There are other areas as well, not doing too bad. But the idea is that what was poor back then is rich now, and what was rich back then is poor now. The fitan come, and then the khaza'in are open as well. And the story of how wealth came to the Gulf is actually very interesting. King Abdul Aziz of Saudi Arabia, the father of these guys, right? Oh, how they have changed. They were very poor, extremely poor. And a lady came to him and said, King, anything. I'm hungry, the kids are hungry, we don't have anything. So he got whatever he can muster up and just gave it to her, right? And she made a dua for him. She said, may Allah open the treasures of the world for you and your children, right? And so fast forward, however long, when the Brits came and they started to uncover the petroleum, King Abdul Aziz said he remembered the dua. He remembered the dua. So dua, they're all enjoying what they enjoy because of the dua of a lady who was poor, right? Anyway, love them, hate them, that's not the point here. The idea is the lessons. And the lesson is, when fitan come, the khaza'in, the treasures, are opened elsewhere. We will always have what we need to deal with the problems, always, right? When the fitan came to our ethnic backgrounds, what door was opened for us? We came here, right? And now we are able to do for the Muslim world what Muslims can't do in the Muslim world. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, remember, the Prophet was asleep, he wakes up, he says Subhanallah, and he says what we just went over. And then he says, أَيْقِظُوا صَوَاحِبَ الْحُجَبِ, wake up the ladies in these homes, meaning his wives. So he said, all my wives wake up now. For what? Tahajjud, prayer. فَرُبَّ كَاسِيَةٍ فِي الدُّنْيَا عَارِيَةٌ فِي الْآخِرَةِ. He says, perhaps, or rather, so many people who are dressed well in this world will be resurrected with nothing. In other words, so many people who have wealth in this world will be bankrupt in the afterlife. What is the Prophet ﷺ doing here? Well, number one, nighttime is not a time where we don't seek knowledge. Nighttime is a time where knowledge is meant to be spread and we are meant to learn. In fact, in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, the only good reasons to stay up after Isha is if you're entertaining a guest, or you're having a conversation with your spouse, spending family time, or you're seeking knowledge. These three things. Other than that, you are better off going to sleep after Isha so that you wake up for tahajjud, or at least wake up for Fajr prayer. Right? Electricity has made that very difficult. Or at least we think. Back in the day, they had their ways of seeing at night. So that's number one. Number two, what is the Prophet ﷺ doing here? When he sees fitan, one of the ways of countering that is salah. One of the ways of countering that is salah. Back in the day, I don't know how long ago, but did you know that Medina has volcanoes? You know this?
I didn't know that.
The lava fields. Have you ever seen areas, especially when you travel from Mecca to Medina, back before even with the bullet train, you'll pass areas that are black rock. That's lava. That's a lava field, right? So sometime, I don't know exactly when, a volcano outside of Medina erupted. And the lava started getting closer and closer to the city of Medina. It got really close to the homes. Like the fires that, a few years ago. Right over the hill, you could see it. A lot of people were evacuated, right? So the people of Medina went to the masjid and they just made dua, salah, and then it stopped. The lava stopped. SubhanAllah. Right? So when there's fitan, it is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to increase salah. But let me be very clear here before somebody misunderstands me. It's not only salah. It is an additional means. It's one extra thing that you do, right? We also have to put the effort to stop it. Right? The fire stopped here, not because people were coming to masjid and praying, but because there were certain protocols. And somebody might ask the question, okay, well then, if we could stop it by ourselves, what's the point of dua? Is it really dua that stops it? It's a valid question. It's a valid observation. But what is the response to that? And the response is as follows. Allah is the one who answers dua. And Allah is the just one. Allah is adil, He's just. And part of justice is that if you use what Allah has created in a way He's meant for it to be used, you get the results that you expect from it. Right? So when an earthquake hits a Western world or Japan, it doesn't do anything. The 9.0 earthquake that hit Japan 10 or so years ago, remember that one? 9.0. It didn't do any damage except within offices and whatnot. No buildings collapsed, there wasn't mass casualties. Whereas the 7-point-something earthquake that happened a year before that in Haiti killed 250,000 people. Right? Now in Japan it led to a tsunami, that's a different story. But let's focus on the earthquake. Or here, a few years ago, the 7.1 earthquake. Nothing happened. But somewhere else, a weaker earthquake in Turkey, how much was it, 6.4? Killed the official numbers, who knows what the real numbers are, the official numbers of 40,000 people. What's the difference? Like why? It seems like Allah is punishing some people and these other people who are kuffar are not being punished, even though they have more severe earthquakes. So what's going on? The answer is Allah is adil. They built structures that understand this is how things work, and they put effort in it, and there is inspections and all of this. That's adil right there. So they did what they are supposed to do as a human being, so it is part of Allah's justice to accommodate that. Right? But in Turkey, what was the reason why one building is completely demolished and the one right next to it is perfectly fine? The inspections, lies, and they went against the adil, against the justice, is what happens. Right? So dua works, and also doing a good job works as well. Right?
شيخ volcano in مدينة تذكر حرات رحات حرة رحات happened 1256
Of Hijrah or
CE.
CE, 1256, meaning 800 years ago. Yeah, during the time of Imam Nawawi. That's right. During the time of Imam Nawawi. Rahmatullah alayh. All right, so the Prophet, he gets his wives up, do salah. Your lesson, when there's difficulty, whether at an individual level or larger, salah. Not only salah is just one other thing that you do. You also have to take the means as well. And then finally, how many people, there will be many people who are clothed in this world, but come back unclothed. Meaning, the Prophet ﷺ is giving us perspective. Just because you're comfortable now does not mean you'll be comfortable tomorrow. Just because you feel settled now doesn't mean you're going to live like that. When you think of Andalusia fell, right? It fell by, whatever their names are, Fernando and, I keep forgetting their names. Elizabeth and whoever, right? What do you think the situation of Andalusia was economically? You think it's bad and whatnot? They were doing just fine.
There was a lot of bad things happening.
There was a lot of bad things happening within, like a lot of un-Islamic things, let's put it that, a lot of un-Islamic things happening, but economically, politically, they were doing fine. But they weren't paying attention. They weren't paying attention. They became so complacent with worldliness, right? That they lost sight, they lost focus. And so they were comfortable yesterday, and then the next day they find themselves refugees in a completely different land. This is the reality. Egypt was doing just fine. In fact, they were flourishing a few decades ago. Now, it's the worst of the worst. Like, it's bad. We have videos of Palestine, of Jerusalem in the late 1800s. People going peaceful, everybody's minding their own business. And now it's a mess, right? This is the reality. So perhaps you are comfortable today, but tomorrow is a worse day. What's the lesson here? Stay focused. Stay focused. The Prophet says this to empower you, not to get you scared. That's not what the religion does. The religion empowers you. And if you want to simply convert what the Prophet is saying into secular words, it simply means masters keep their eye on the prize. And they don't become preoccupied with fame, with wealth, with comfort, or any of these things. Their comfort comes from the pursuit. Their comfort comes from accomplishment. Their comfort comes from always wanting more in terms of their goals. Better. Nothing's ever enough when it comes to the project that they're doing. They always want it to be better. Allahu ta'ala alam. We'll have to stop there. Sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. We finished Hadith 95.